I was sitting on the floor of my husband's home office, surrounded by 12 years of his professional life, when his phone rang. It was a Saturday morning, 9 days after his funeral, and I had finally found the strength to begin going through his things. The particular kind of strength that arrives. Not because the grief has lessened, but because the practical demands of a life that must continue assert themselves, regardless of whether you feel ready for them. The phone was on his desk, plugged into the charger where he had always kept it, and I had not touched it in 9 days because touching it had felt, in those first days, like a boundary I was not ready to cross. I looked at it when it rang. The screen showed a name I did not recognize, a woman's name. I picked it up because I was his wife and he was gone, and his phone was now part of the estate I was responsible for managing, and I answered it the way you answer a dead person's phone, with the careful composure of someone who has been practicing composure for 9 days and is very tired of it. I said, "Hello, this is Margaret, Richard's wife." And the woman on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment, a specific quality of quiet that I recognized immediately as the quiet of someone receiving information, that is reorganizing everything they thought they knew. And then she said, in a voice that I will hear for the rest of my life, that she was sorry, that she had not known, that she had been married to Richard for 11 years. Welcome back to the channel. Get comfortable. Let me tell you what we found when we started looking. My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 53 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was married to Richard Calloway for 19 years. Or I believed I was married to him for 19 years, which I have come to understand is a different thing from the same thing, in ways that took me a long time and a great deal of precise and painful work to fully process. Richard was a commercial real estate developer, 56 years old when he died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March. A man who had built a regional development business from a small brokerage operation into a company with projects across 4 states and revenues that I had always understood, in general terms, to be substantial without knowing, until after his death, exactly how substantial they were, or where all of them were located. He was charming and intelligent and genuinely good company, and he had, for 19 years, been the person I believed I knew most completely in the world. I was wrong about that in a way that I am still, 2 years later, in the process of fully understanding. I want to tell you about Richard before I tell you about what I found, because I think he deserves to be understood as a full person rather than simply as the man who maintained 2 marriages simultaneously for 11 years, and because understanding who he was makes the specific mechanics of how he managed what he managed more comprehensible, if not more forgivable. Richard was the kind of man who could walk into any room and within 20 minutes us know the names of everyone in it, and the thing each person most wanted to talk about, and who had the specific gift of making each person feel that their particular topic was the one he found most interesting. He was organized in the way that people are organized when organization is a professional necessity rather than a personal preference, keeping meticulous records of his business dealings while maintaining, in his personal life, a surface of easy warmth that did not suggest the same level of underlying structure. He traveled extensively for work, which I had always accepted as the natural consequence of a regional development business, and which, I would eventually understand, had been the structural mechanism that made everything else possible. Our marriage had been, by every measure I had available to me during its 19 years, a good one. We had met when I was 32 and he was 35, at a charity event in Charlotte that we had both attended through different professional networks, and the connection between us had been immediate in the way that genuine compatibility sometimes announced itself quickly and without much ambiguity. We had dated for 18 months before marrying, had bought the house in Charlotte that I still live in, had built a life together that included travel and genuine friendship, and the specific comfort of 2 people who have learned each other well enough to move through a shared life with relatively little friction. We had one child together, a daughter named Claire, who was 16 when Richard died, and who is now 18 and beginning her first year of university, a fact that Richard did not live to see, and that I carry with me with the specific weight of things that should have been witnessed and were not. What I did not know for 19 years was that Richard had met a woman named Diane Pearson 14 months after our wedding, in Raleigh, where he had been developing a commercial property complex, and that he had maintained a relationship with her that had progressed, 11 years before his death, into a second marriage conducted in a jurisdiction where his first marriage was not on record, using documentation that I would later learn from an attorney had been obtained through a process I can only describe as deliberately engineered rather than accidentally overlooked. Diane had a daughter with Richard, a girl named Sophie who was 9 years old when Richard died, and who had grown up believing, as completely and as reasonably as I had believed what I believed, that her father was a man who traveled frequently for work and who came home to them in Raleigh, on a schedule that was irregular but consistent enough to feel like the ordinary rhythm of a life built around a demanding career. I want to be precise about what I knew and did not know during those 19 years, because I think precision matters in a story like this, and because I have no interest in presenting myself as more perceptive than I was, or less trusting than I was. I knew Richard traveled. I knew his schedule was unpredictable in the way that the schedules of people who build things across multiple locations are genuinely unpredictable. I knew there were weeks when I could not reach him easily, and that these weeks corresponded, as far as I understood, to periods of intensive project work that required his presence on site in ways that made regular communication difficult. I had, over 19 years, occasionally felt a vague unease about the texture of his absences, a feeling I had always attributed to the ordinary anxiety of a marriage, in which one partner's work consumed more of their presence than felt entirely comfortable, and that I had managed, as many people manage uncomfortable feelings in otherwise functioning marriages, by deciding that the evidence of the marriage's overall health was more persuasive than the occasional discomfort of a feeling I could not point to specifically in name. I had been wrong to reach that conclusion. The feeling had been trying to tell me something real. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in March, at 56 years old, of a cardiac event that arrived without warning in the specific way that cardiac events sometimes arrive in men of his age and apparent health, suddenly and without the preparation that would have allowed him to manage what he left behind in any organized way. He was at the Charlotte office when it happened. His assistant found him at 9:15, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital at 10:40. I was called at 10:50, and I drove to the hospital, and I sat in a room with a doctor who told me things I was not fully able to hear, and I called Claire's school, and I called Richard's business partner, and I called my sister, and I did all of these things with the specific automated competence that acute shock sometimes produces. The ability to complete necessary tasks in the complete absence of any genuine processing of what is happening. The 9 days between Richard's death and the Saturday morning his phone rang were the longest 9 days of my life. Longer in their way than the days of Claire's difficult birth. Longer than the days surrounding my own mother's death 4 years earlier. Because those had been losses I had been given some preparation for, and this was a loss that arrived all at once, and without warning, and that I was managing entirely alone in the sense that the person who would ordinarily have been beside me in a crisis of this magnitude was the person who was gone. Claire was with me, and my sister came from Raleigh, and Richard's business partner, Gerald, was present and helpful in the practical matters. But the specific aloneness of losing a spouse is its own category of experience, and I was inside it completely for those 9 days. I had not gone into Richard's home office in those 9 days. The office was at the back of our house, A room he had always kept organized in the specific way of someone who understood that the organization of a workspace was itself a professional tool, and I had respected the boundary of it during our marriage in the easy way that couples respect each other's professional spaces, when both people have enough of their own professional identity not to need to occupy the other person's. In the 9 days after his death, I had not crossed the threshold of that office because crossing it felt, in those days, like the beginning of a process I was not yet ready for, the process of going through a dead person's things and making decisions about what to keep and what to release and what to understand, a process that requires a kind of finality I had not yet been able to locate in myself. On the 9th day I found it. Not the finality exactly, but the specific practical necessity that functions as finality's substitute when finality itself is unavailable. I had received 3 calls that week from Richard's accountant about documents that needed to be located for the estate process. And the documents were, as far as the accountant knew, in Richard's home office. I needed to go in. I went in on Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and a folder of notes about what I was looking for and the particular braced quality of someone who has prepared themselves for something difficult and is executing the preparation. The office was exactly as Richard had left it, which meant it was organized in the meticulous way he had always kept it, the desk clear except for the phone charger and a legal pad with notes in his handwriting that I could not make myself read yet. The filing cabinet closed and labeled in his precise hand, the bookshelves arranged by subject in a system that had always reflected the specific way his professional mind categorized information. I had sat down on the floor beside the filing cabinet and begun going through the lower drawers, which was where the accountant had told me the relevant documents were most likely to be, when the phone on the desk rang. I looked at it. The screen showed a name, Carol. I did not know anyone named Carol in Richard's life. I picked it up. I answered it. I said, "Hello, this is Margaret, Richard's wife." And the woman on the other end said she was sorry, that she had not known, that she had been married to Richard for 11 years. And the office, which had been quiet with the particular quality of a room belonging to someone who is gone, became a different kind of quiet entirely. Her name was not Carol. Carol was the name she had saved herself under in Richard's phone, a name that was not her name, which told me something about the level of operational management that had gone into the maintenance of Richard's parallel lives. Her real name was Diane Pearson, and she was 47 years old, and she lived in Raleigh. And she had a 9-year-old daughter named Sophie, who had called Richard Daddy for her entire life. She told me these things in the first 5 minutes of the call, in the specific urgent way of someone who has just understood that every assumption their life has been built on requires immediate re-examination, and who is processing that understanding out loud because there is no alternative. I listened. I did not say much. I asked her one question, which was whether she had known about me. She said no. I believed her. The quality of her shock was too specific and too unmanaged to be performed. We talked for 40 minutes. 2 women in 2 cities. Both of us sitting in the specific wreckage of the same revelation. Both of us trying to understand, in real time, what we were now dealing with and what it meant for the lives we had believed we were living. At the end of those 40 minutes, I told Diane that I was going to need to speak with an attorney, and that I thought she should do the same, and that I would be in touch when I had more information. She said she understood. I ended the call and I sat on the floor of Richard's home office for a long time, without moving. The phone in my hand, the filing cabinet open beside me, the legal pad with his handwriting on the desk above me. And I understood that the estate I was now responsible for managing was considerably more complicated than anything I had imagined when I walked into that room 40 minutes earlier. I called an attorney on Monday morning, 2 days after the phone call from Diane. Her name was Patricia Ossie, and she specialized in estate litigation and complex asset recovery. recommended to me by my own longtime attorney, who had handled my personal legal matters for years, and who had listened to my account of the Saturday phone call with the specific focused attention of someone who understands immediately that what they are hearing falls outside the ordinary scope of what they handle, and who wastes no time in directing you toward the right person. Patricia was in her late 40s, precise and direct in the way of someone who had spent her career navigating situations of significant complexity, and had developed, through that navigation, a complete absence of the impulse to soften information that needed to be delivered clearly. I liked her immediately for exactly this reason. I told her everything: the phone call, Diane, the 11 years, Sophie, the name Carol saved in the phone. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me 4 questions. She asked whether Richard had left a will. I told her yes, that his attorney had been in contact, and that the will reading was scheduled for the following week. She asked whether I had any knowledge of the structure of his business assets, the specific entities through which his development projects were held. I told her I had a general understanding that the business operated through several LLCs, but that I did not know the details of how they were structured or what they held. She asked whether I had accessed Richard's home office files beyond the initial search that had been interrupted by the phone call. I told her I had not gone back in since Saturday. She told me to go back in that day, to photograph every document I found before moving anything, and to bring her everything that related to financial accounts, business entities, property holdings, and legal arrangements of any kind. She said to do this before the will reading, and she said it with the specific emphasis of someone who understood that the will reading was going to produce information that would be more useful to me if I had already assembled my own independent picture of the asset landscape. Before hearing what Richard's attorney had prepared, I went back into Richard's office that same Monday afternoon, and I spent 4 hours in it. I photographed every document in every drawer of the filing cabinet before removing anything. I photographed the contents of the bookshelves, the spines of the legal binders that lined the middle shelf, each one labeled in Richard's precise handwriting with dates and project names and entity designations. I found, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, a section that was separated from the rest by a manila divider labeled Simply Personal, and I photographed everything in this section before reading any of it. Because Patricia had told me to photograph before reading, and I was following her instructions with the same precision she had used in delivering them. What I found in the personal section of that filing cabinet, and what I brought to Patricia's office the following morning, in a folder that was considerably thicker than I had anticipated when I began the search, was the beginning of a picture that would take several more weeks to fully assemble, but whose outline was already visible in those first documents. There were financial account statements, not the joint accounts I had known about, not the business accounts whose existence I had been generally aware of, but individual accounts in Richard's name alone, accounts at 3 different financial institutions, accounts whose combined balance, across the most recent statements I found, totaled approximately $1.4 million. There were property records, 2 properties in Raleigh whose addresses I did not recognize and whose ownership documentation listed Richard's name, alongside a holding company name I had never seen before. And there was, in the very back of the personal section, a document that I almost missed because it was thinner than the surrounding folders and filed without a label, which was a marriage certificate, dated 11 years earlier in a state that was not North Carolina, between Richard James Calloway and Diane Marie Pearson. I sat with that marriage certificate in my hands for a long moment before putting it in the folder with everything else. Not because I was surprised by its existence. I had known since Saturday that the second marriage was real, but because holding the physical document Seeing Richard's signature on it in the same handwriting as the notes on the legal pad on his desk made the reality of it concrete in a way that the phone call had not quite accomplished. He had signed this. He had stood in a room somewhere and signed this document, and he had driven home to Charlotte afterward, and he had not said a single word about it for 11 years. Patricia reviewed everything I brought her over the course of 2 days, working through each document with the methodical attention of someone assembling a financial picture from its component parts. She called me on Wednesday evening and asked me to come in the following morning, and when I sat across from her desk on Thursday, she told me what she had found, and she told it to me directly, without softening, which was what I had come to expect from her and what I needed. The asset picture, she told me, was significantly more complex than the will I was going to hear. Read the following week was likely to reflect. The 2 Raleigh properties, held through the LLC, whose name had appeared on the ownership documentation, represented a combined market value of approximately $800,000 based on current Raleigh market assessments. The individual accounts whose statements I had found contained a combined balance of $1.4 million. And there was, Patricia told me, a 4th financial account that she had identified through the business entity filings she had been researching independently. An account held in the name of the same LLC, whose most recent available balance, drawn from a document I had not found in the filing cabinet, but that Patricia had located through the public business records associated with the entity, was approximately $2.1 million. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $2.1 million in an account held through a business entity whose name I had not known existed 1 week earlier. An account that was not in my name, not in our joint names, not in any structure I had previously been aware of, sitting in a financial institution in Raleigh, alongside 2 properties in Raleigh whose existence I had also not known about. Raleigh, where Diane lived. Raleigh, where Richard had been developing commercial property for the duration of the period in which he had been maintaining a second marriage. The geography of the hidden assets was not a coincidence, and Patricia did not present it as one. She told me that the will, reading the following week, was going to be an important moment, but that I should attend it understanding that the will, whatever it said, was almost certainly not a complete picture of Richard's assets, and that the process of establishing what the complete picture actually was and what my legal rights to it were would take considerably longer than a single reading in an attorney's office. She told me she was going to file for a formal estate inventory, a legal process that would require a comprehensive accounting of all assets, of the entity structures through which they were held, and that this filing would prevent any assets from being moved or distributed while the inventory was being completed. She told me to say as little as possible at the will reading, and to let her do the talking if any questions arose that went beyond the straightforward reading of the document. The will reading was held on a Friday afternoon at the office of Richard's estate attorney, a man named Douglas Marsh, who had been Richard's personal attorney for 12 years, and who greeted me with the specific careful warmth of someone who knows considerably more than they are currently required to say, and who is managing that knowledge with professional composure. I arrived with Patricia, which I noticed produced a fractional shift in Douglas's expression, the specific recalibration of a man who had expected to be managing this meeting in a particular way and has just understood that the management is going to be more complex than anticipated. Diane was not at the will reading. I had not known whether she would be, and I had prepared myself for either possibility, but she was not there, and I noted her absence without commenting on it. What was there, seated in the chair across the conference table from Patricia and me, was a man I had not expected, a man named Gerald Foster, who introduced himself as representing the interests of Diane Pearson and her daughter Sophie in the estate proceedings. The presence of Gerald Foster in that room told me that Diane had moved quickly in the days since our phone call, that she had found an attorney and briefed him, and that he had assessed the situation as one worth appearing at the will reading for, which told me something about what Gerald Foster believed his client's legal position to be. Douglas read the will. It was, as Patricia had anticipated, a document that reflected a version of Richard's assets that was considerably less complete than the picture Patricia had assembled in the preceding week. The will left the Charlotte house and its contents to me, along with a joint investment account whose balance was approximately $280,000 and whose existence I had known about. It left a series of specific personal items to Claire, and it designated the remainder of the estate, described in language that was deliberately general rather than specifically enumerated, to be distributed according to the terms of the relevant business entity agreements, which was legal language that meant, Patricia explained to me quietly when Douglas finished reading, that the will had been drafted in a way that allowed the business entity structures to govern the distribution of the assets held within them, rather than addressing those assets directly in the will itself. This was, Patricia told me afterward in the hallway outside Douglas's office, not an accident. It was a drafting choice, a specific and deliberate way of structuring a will that kept the largest assets outside the direct reach of the will's provisions, and inside the governance structures of the business entities. Structures whose terms Patricia had not yet been able to fully examine, but which she intended to examine very thoroughly in the weeks ahead. Gerald Foster stopped us in the hallway as we were leaving. He was direct in the specific way of attorneys who have assessed a situation and decided that directness is more efficient than positioning. He told Patricia that his client had a legitimate claim to a portion of Richard's estate, based on the documented marriage and the existence of a minor child, and that he believed a negotiated resolution was in everyone's interest. Given these complexities of the asset structure and the likely length and cost of a fully contested proceeding, Patricia told him she appreciated his directness and that she would be in touch once she had completed her review of the entity structures. They shook hands. We walked out. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Diane that same evening, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next, and because I think it is the most important conversation in this entire story. More important than the will reading, and more important than the deposition, and more important even than the settlement. Because it was the conversation in which two women who had been placed, without their knowledge or consent, in opposition to each other by the decisions of a man who was no longer alive to answer for those decisions, chose to do something different. Deanne called me at 7 in the evening, I answered. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. She said she wanted me to know that she had not instructed Gerald to take an adversarial position, that she understood the situation was not of my making any more than it was of hers, and that what she wanted, more than any particular financial outcome, was for Sophie to understand something true and real about her father rather than a version of him that would eventually collapse when she was old enough to find the documents herself. She said she thought the two of us, working together rather than against each other, had a better chance of understanding what Richard had actually built and what he had actually intended than either of us working against the other, through attorneys who had every professional incentive to extend the conflict. She said she knew this was an unusual thing to propose and that she would understand if I said no. I did not say no. I said I needed to think about it and that I would call her back the following day. I called Patricia that night and told her what Diane had proposed. Patricia was quiet for a moment and then said that in 20 years of estate litigation, she had seen this approach attempted twice, and that both times it had produced a faster and more complete resolution than the adversarial processes would have, and that if I trusted Diane's stated intentions, it was worth considering seriously. I told Patricia I thought Diane's stated intentions were genuine. Patricia said then consider it seriously. I did. I called Diane the following morning and told her I was willing to try. Part 3, I want to tell you about the decision Diane and I made to work together, because I think it requires some explanation for people who might find it difficult to understand, and because I think the honest version of why two women in our specific situation might choose collaboration over conflict is more interesting and more useful than the simplified version that presents it as simply an act of mutual generosity. It was not purely generous. It was strategic in the specific way that decisions made by intelligent people, under difficult circumstances, are often simultaneously genuine and strategic, and the genuineness and the strategy were not in conflict with each other, but were, in fact, the same thing looked at from two different angles. Diane and I were both, independently and for different reasons, in a weaker position than we would have been if Richard had died without the complication of the parallel lives. I was in a weaker position because the assets I had not known about were held in entity structures whose governance documents I had not yet seen, and whose terms might, depending on how Richard had structured them, limit my access to them in ways that a straightforward marital estate would not. Diane was in a weaker position because her marriage, conducted in a jurisdiction where Richard's first marriage was not on record, occupied a legally ambiguous status that Gerald Foster had been careful not to overstate in his conversation with Patricia, because overstating it would have invited a direct challenge that might have produced an unfavorable ruling early in the process. We were both, in other words, working with incomplete information about an asset structure that had been deliberately designed to be difficult to see clearly from any single vantage point. And we both understood, after our conversation, that the person with the most complete view of that structure was Richard himself, and Richard was gone. What we had, between the two of us, was the combined access to every piece of documentation that existed in both of our households relating to Richard's financial and business life, documentation that neither of us had seen in its entirety, because Richard had maintained, with the specific operational precision of a man who had been managing a complex parallel existence for 11 years, a careful separation between the information available in Charlotte and the information available in Raleigh. Diane had documents in her Raleigh home that I had not seen. I had documents in the Charlotte filing cabinet that she had not seen. Together, we had something closer to the complete picture than either of us had alone. And the complete picture, Patricia had told me, was what determined the outcome of the estate process more than any other single factor. We met in person for the first time 3 weeks after Richard's death, at a hotel midway between Charlotte and Raleigh, in a conference room that Diane had reserved, because she had thought correctly that a neutral space would be better than either of our homes for a first meeting between two women who were still, whatever their stated intentions toward each other, processing an enormous amount of complicated emotion alongside the practical matter of the estate. I want to tell you about that meeting, because I think it was one of the strangest and most significant conversations I have ever had. And because I think the honest account of it is more interesting than a sanitized version would be. Diane was smaller than I had expected, which is an odd thing to notice as a person, but which I noticed immediately when she walked into that conference room, and she had the specific quality of someone who had been crying recently and had stopped recently, and was managing the residuals evidence of it with deliberate composure. She looked at me when she came in with an expression that I recognized immediately because I had seen it in my own mirror in the preceding weeks, the expression of someone trying to see, in the person across from them, the shape of the betrayal they are both inside. We shook hands, which was slightly absurd given the circumstances, and which we both acknowledged with the kind of brief, exhausted almost laughter that sometimes arrives in situations that are too painful for any other response. We spent 4 hours in that conference room. We went through the documents Diane had brought from Raleigh, and the copies I had brought from Charlotte, laying them out on the conference table in the methodical way that Patricia had suggested, organizing them by entity and by date rather than by location, so that the full chronological picture of Richard's financial life could be assembled from both sources simultaneously. What emerged from that assembly, over those 4 hours, was a picture that neither of us had been able to see from our individual positions, and that was, in its fully assembled form, considerably more coherent than the fragmented version had suggested. Richard had been, for at least 15 years, systematically building a parallel financial structure alongside the visible life he maintained in Charlotte. The 2 Raleigh properties were part of a larger portfolio of 6 investment properties, 4 in Raleigh and 2 in a smaller city further east, all held through the LLC that had appeared on the ownership documentation. The $2.1 million account was the operating account for this entity, funded by the rental income from the 6 properties, and by a series of transfers from Richard's business development company that had been structured, Patricia would later explain, as management fees paid to the LLC for services rendered, that had the practical effect of moving money from the visible business into the parallel entity in a way that was entirely legitimate on its face, and that required looking at the complete picture across both entities to understand its full significance. What Richard had built, in other words, was not a hidden slush fund of the kind that suggests simple greed or simple deception. It was a parallel financial life of genuine complexity and genuine scale, built with the same methodical attention to structure and documentation that had characterized his professional work, and maintained for 15 years with a consistency that was, in its own way, a kind of achievement, however deeply wrong the purpose it served. Patricia, when I described the full picture to her after the Raleigh meeting, was quiet for a moment, and then said that in her experience, the level of organizational sophistication required to maintain what Richard had maintained for 15 years was not common, and that the sophistication itself was something I should factor into how I thought about the preceding 19 years of my marriage. I understood what she meant. A man who was capable of this level of sustained and organized deception had been practicing a form of deception throughout our marriage that went beyond the specific hidden assets and the specific second marriage. The person I had believed I knew most completely in the world had been, in the most fundamental sense, someone I had not known at all. I want to tell you about what we found when Patricia and Gerald, working together at Diane's and my instruction rather than in opposition to each other, went through the governance documents of the LLC, because this is the part of the story that surprised both of us most completely, and that I have thought about most often in the 2 years since. The LLC had been established 15 years earlier, 3 years before Richard and Diane's marriage and 4 years after Richard and my own wedding. Its governance documents, the operating agreement that specified how the entity was owned and how its assets would be distributed upon the death or departure of its members, listed 2 members. Richard James Calloway, with a 60% ownership interest, and Margaret Ann Calloway, with a 40% ownership interest. My name, my full legal name spelled correctly, on a document establishing my ownership of 40% of an entity I had not known existed. Holding assets I had not known about, in a city I had not known, Richard was building a parallel life in. I want to be very precise about what this meant, and what it did not mean, because I think precision matters here more than anywhere else in this story. It did not mean that Richard had intended to tell me about the LLC, and had simply not gotten around to it. The LLC's operating agreement contained provisions that made it clear the entity had been designed to operate invisibly from the perspective of its minority member, with all management authority vested in the majority member, and with no requirement for the minority member's active participation or knowledge of the entity's operations. My name was on the document as an ownership interest, not as an operational participant. Richard had given me 40% of an entity he controlled entirely, without telling me the entity existed, which was simultaneously a form of provision and a form of control, a way of ensuring that a significant portion of what he had built would come to me without requiring him to disclose the existence of it during his lifetime. Patricia sat with this document for a long time before she explained its implications to me. Then she said, carefully and precisely, that Richard had, in his own way, and through a mechanism that was legally sound if personally extraordinary, provided for me in the parallel financial structure in a way that the will itself had not addressed directly, and that my 40% ownership interest in the LLC was a legal right that existed independently of the will, independently of the estate proceedings, and independently of any claim that Diane or Sophie might make against the estate through the channels available to them. The 40% interest was mine. It had been mine since the LLC was established 15 years earlier, and the current value of 40% of the LLC's assets, including the 6 properties and the operating account balance, was approximately $1.4 million. Deanne's reaction when Patricia and Gerald presented this finding to both of us together, in a second meeting in the same hotel conference room, was the reaction of a woman who had prepared herself for a difficult outcome and was processing a slightly different difficult outcome than the one she had anticipated. She was not angry, or at least she did not show anger, which may or may not be the same thing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked Gerald what Sophie's position was given the structure of the LLC and the will together. Gerald told her, carefully, that Sophie's position, as Richard's biological child, gave her a legitimate claim against the estate for a share of the assets that were not already designated to a specific beneficiary, and that the assets not covered by the LLC ownership structure or the specific will provisions amounted to approximately $800,000. The individual accounts whose statements I had found in the filing cabinet, which had passed outside the will through beneficiary designations that Richard had made years earlier and that named me as the primary beneficiary on 2 of the 3 accounts, and Diane as the primary beneficiary on 1. I want to tell you about the decision I made regarding Sophie's claim because I think it is the decision in this entire story that I feel most clearly was right, and that I am most willing to defend to anyone who questions it. Sophie was 9 years old. She had lost her father. She had lost her father in the specific and compounding way of losing him first to death, and then to the revelation that the father she had known was not fully the father who had existed, that the life she had understood herself to be part of was considerably more complicated than she had been allowed to know. She was 9 years old and she had done nothing wrong, and she was going to spend years, as she grew older, understanding things about her father that would require her to substantially revise her understanding of her own history. The least she deserved, in the middle of that process, was financial security. I instructed Patricia to make a specific proposal to Gerald. From the individual accounts that had passed to me through the beneficiary designation, I would establish a trust for Sophie, funded with an amount that Patricia and I had calculated as sufficient to cover her education through university and provide a meaningful foundation for her adult life. Approximately $250,000. This was not a legal requirement. It was a choice. I made it because I believed it was right and because I believed, in some specific and inarticulate way, that I have not been able to fully put into words even 2 years later, that it was what a person of genuine integrity would do in a situation that Richard's choices had created, and that Sophie had had no part in creating. Deanne, when Gerald conveyed the proposal, called me directly rather than responding through the attorneys. She said, "Thank you," in the specific way of someone who means it completely and does not have more words available for the feeling than those 2. I told her I hoped Sophie would be okay. She said she thought she would be, eventually. We were quiet for a moment on the phone, the specific quiet of two women who had been through something extraordinary together and who did not have a language for it because the situation was genuinely outside the range of situations for which language has been developed. Then we said goodbye and ended the call, and I sat in my kitchen for a while afterward, thinking about Richard and about the life he had built, and about the specific and strange form of provision he had made for me, inside a structure designed to remain invisible, and about what it meant that the man I had not known had nonetheless, in some compartmentalized and complicated way, been thinking about me across 15 years of building something he intended never to show me while he was alive. The estate proceedings closed 8 months after Richard's death. My 40% LLC interest was formally transferred to my sole ownership following the buyout of the remaining 60% interest, which was funded through the operating account and produced net of legal fees. And the Sophie Trust contribution, a total settlement that included the Charlotte House, the joint investment account, one of the 3 individual accounts, and the LLC assets, representing a combined value of approximately $2.3 million. Diane received the Raleigh property that Richard had used as their family home, valued at the lower end of the Raleigh market due to the mortgage that remained on it, the individual account that had named her as primary beneficiary, and a specific contribution from the LLC operating account that Patricia and Gerald had negotiated as an acknowledgement of Sophie's position as Richard's biological child. I want to tell you about where I am now, 2 years after that Saturday morning in Richard's office, because I think the honest version of where I am is more useful than a version that presents the financial resolution as equivalent to any kind of complete resolution. Because it is not. The money is real, and the legal outcomes are real, and they matter in the specific and concrete ways that financial security matters to a person's life and to a child's future. Claire is at university, and her tuition is paid, and her future is not constrained by the financial uncertainty that Richard's death might otherwise have created. These things are real, and I am grateful for them. What is also real is that I am still, 2 years later, in the ongoing process of understanding my marriage. Not the practical understanding, the financial picture and the legal structure, and the mechanics of how Richard maintained what he maintained. That understanding arrived relatively quickly. In the months of the estate process, assembled from documents and entity filings, and the combined archive that Diane and I had spread across a hotel conference table. The deeper understanding, the understanding of who Richard actually was and what the 19 years I spent with him actually were, is a slower and less linear process that I am not going to pretend is complete, simply because the legal proceedings are finished. I have spoken with a therapist throughout this period, a woman who specializes in complicated grief, which is the clinical term for grief that is complicated by circumstances beyond the simple loss of a person. Grief that includes the loss of the version of the person you believed you knew, alongside the loss of the actual person. Grief that requires you to mourn something you cannot fully define, because the thing you are mourning is a version of your own life that turned out to be different from how you understood it. She has been useful in the specific way that precise and non-judgmental professional support is useful, helping me distinguish between what I actually know and what I am filling in with assumption, helping me understand that the Richard who had been genuinely present in our marriage, who had been a real father to Claire and a real partner in the ways that he had been a partner, was not entirely a performance, that people are capable of genuine connection and genuine deception simultaneously, that the coexistence of these things does not resolve into a clean verdict about who a person was. Claire knows the full story. I told her, when she was 17, 6 months after Richard's death, when I had enough of the picture assembled to tell it honestly and completely, rather than in fragments that would have required later revision, She processed it in the way that teenagers sometimes process devastating information, which is to say incompletely and then completely and then incompletely again, as different dimensions of it became accessible to her at different stages. She has not spoken about her father publicly, which is her choice, and one I respect. And she has not resolved her feelings about him into any simple verdict, which is also her choice, and one I think reflects a genuine and appropriate complexity rather than an avoidance. She knows Sophie exists. She has not sought contact with her, but she has not ruled it out, and I have told her that whatever she decides about, that is hers to decide, and that I will support whatever she chooses. Deanne and I have stayed in occasional contact in the 2 years since the proceedings closed, the specific occasional contact of two people who have been through something that creates a bond without necessarily creating a friendship, who check in on significant dates and share brief updates on how their children are doing, and who understand that the connection between them is real and permanent, and does not require regular maintenance to remain so. Sophie is 11 now. Diane sent me a photograph of her on her birthday last year, a school photograph, the kind with the slightly awkward smile of a child who has been told to look natural and is trying very hard to do exactly that. I have it in a drawer in my kitchen, not on display, not hidden, simply there, in the specific somewhere of things that are too complicated to put away completely, and too complicated to put out where you see them every day. I think about Richard differently at different times and in different ways, which I have come to understand is the appropriate response to someone who was genuinely more than one thing. I think about the man who asked good questions and remembered details and built a company from a small brokerage into a regional enterprise. And I think about the man who signed a marriage certificate in a jurisdiction where his first marriage was not on record and drove home afterward without saying a word. I think about the man who put my name on the LLC operating agreement 15 years ago, who ensured into a structure he designed to be invisible, that I would be provided for in a way that the will alone would not have accomplished. And I wonder, in the way that you wonder about things you will never be able to verify, what he understood about what he was doing and what he intended by it. I do not have an answer to this. I have come to believe that not having an answer is the appropriate condition for a question like this, that some things about the people we lose remain genuinely unknowable, and that the acceptance of that unknowability is itself a form of resolution, not the resolution of understanding, but the resolution of no longer requiring understanding in order to move forward. The house in Charlotte is mine. Claire's tuition is paid. Sophie's trust is established. The filing cabinet in Richard's home office has been cleared and refilled with documents that are entirely mine, documents that I understand completely, and that contain no surprises. I have gone back to work. The project management consulting I had reduced during the estate proceedings, and I have found that the return to work carries the specific satisfaction of re-entering a domain that is entirely legible, where the documents mean what they say, and the structures are what they appear to be, and the people involved are who they present themselves as being. I have found this satisfaction more meaningful than I might have found it before, in the way that things you have temporarily lost their access to often become more clearly valuable when you return to them. If you have ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was someone you did not fully know, I want you to know that the discovery does not retroactively erase everything that was real. Some of what was real remains real even after the discovery. The grief of losing what was real and the anger at what was false can coexist without resolving into each other, and the coexistence of them is not a failure of processing, but an accurate response to a genuinely complicated truth. Give yourself the time that kind of truth requires. Do not rush toward a verdict about a person or a marriage, or a chapter of your life simply because the legal proceedings have closed and the documents are filed and the world outside is ready to move on to the next thing. Some understandings take longer than legal proceedings, some grief takes longer than settlements, and some questions about the people we loved and lost remain appropriately and permanently without complete answers. Tell me your story in the comments. I am here, and I read every single one,